Fantasy is the genre of whimsical adventure. Daring heroes, gallant adventurers, bands of misfits against all the evils in the world. A place where, no matter how grim the story, good always triumphs. The monsters and the ne'er-do-wells of the night banished back to where they belong, as our heroes ride off into a better tomorrow. But what if we turn the page to a darker story? Heroes turned villains. The night a playground for terrible maledictions and monsters. And the great evils of the beyond never staying dead. Where, at the end of the story, there are no victors. No glorious sunset and better tomorrow. Only survivors. And those are the stories I wish to talk about tonight. Well, hello, and welcome back to the Stygian Study. It's me, your host, whose name I haven't really come up with yet. And welcome back to another video. Today's topic, as you can tell by the, title of the video, we're going to be talking about fantasy horror. And what is fantasy horror? Well, it's a term I coined like a month ago to describe fantasy that is not quite dark fantasy, but more aligned with fantasy that is just straight up horrifying and focusing on the scary aspects of a fantasy world. So, you know how when you have a fantasy world and you'll have factions like, let's say, the Scourge from World of Warcraft, you focus on these factions and you don't really get to see how scary they are. Sure, you see some of the horrific elements, some things that might be spooky and mischievous and evil, but you don't really get to focus on the actual horrifying outcomes. You're always more powerful than the monsters you're facing. You are always greater than the forces that you are about to face. And when it comes to fantasy that I like, I find it sorely lacking that we don't have more that focuses on those elements. And why is that? I'm gonna be honest, I couldn't tell you. I don't know if it's just not profitable or if it's just more fun to be super powerful and badass and kick the shit out of people. Very likely. But I wanted to go through and talk about some of my favorite pieces of horror fantasy and or horror adjacent fantasy as I get a little flexible with certain things. But I want to emphasize a big thing about horror fantasy. It is the fact that this is not meant to make you feel powerful. You see, in other games, you might have to hunt down a werewolf or go fight monsters. And yeah, the werewolf is going to be kind of scary, but at the end of the day, it's going to be more cool than anything. I mean, look at Van Helsing. The vampires and werewolves in that movie are generally cool. But what I want to focus on is just how scary those elements can be. What is it like to be a regular person against an actual werewolf? What is it like to be a regular person who somehow survives an attack from an undead horde? These are stories that I wish we got to explore more because I feel that the fantasy genre as a vehicle is just ripe for storytelling opportunities. And I would like to note that this video was recorded over the course of a month through various different rants and rambles that I had at different points in the day. Some of it while I was hungover. You get to guess when that actually was. So, kick back, relax, enjoy a nice backlog video from me, and hopefully we can get some discussion brewing about this topic. So let's move on to our first example, Diablo. And Diablo, funnily enough, is baked directly into this channel's DNA. It's the inspiration for the name Stygian Study, and the iconic Tristram theme is actually the inspiration behind the still unreleased theme for this channel. But did you know this game is far, far more than its ARPG elements and clearing rooms of demons with thermobaric explosions. No, Diablo is actually quite the terrifying experience when you put its story underneath a careful lens. The first Diablo game is actually kind of just a straight-up horror game. You, as a nameless adventurer, head into the town of Tristram to investigate the troubles of what had been plaguing the area, the madness of the king, and the disappearance of his sons, and why are there demons prowling around in the night, and strange sounds emanating from the town's chapel halls. And your adventure is not some badass yet semi-tense, gritty delve into blood-soaked caves while you're kind of just kicking ass and taking names, but it's a genuinely unnerving journey into the heart of Tristram to find that this little town was built upon an ancient labyrinth that was created to house the Lord of Terror himself, Diablo, who is an ancient and immortal being that is the very embodiment of the concept of fear. With fighting off all his minions such as the Butcher, Archbishop Lazarus, and swarms of demons along with the slain King of Tristram himself. And at the end of this journey, even in what seems like victory, there's nothing but your utter defeat, as you find that the Lord of Terror has purposefully lured you here so that he could claim you as a vessel strong enough for him to inherit and thus walk the earth with. And this is where the horror in Diablo lies. Not in its gameplay, sadly, but it is in its story that Diablo becomes horrifying. The story of Diablo is one of utmost futility. In each game, since the very first one, in a stark contrast to the power fantasy gameplay characteristic by ARPGs, we essentially lose. In Diablo 2, you chase Diablo and his brothers, Baal and Mephisto, across the world of Sanctuary to hopefully put a stop to their plots. But in the very end, they succeed. They attain their goals. They corrupt the very heart of Sanctuary itself, despite the fact that we put a stop to them. And in the end of the third game, one of the angels, 𝒞𝒽𝒻, who the High Heavens are supposed to be kind of a good to neutral aligned faction, slaughters over half of the human population. And in the fourth game, we get to see the ramifications of this. We get to see how empty and dead the world is. And in that fourth game, I fear the worst consequences come to light. Because in order to put a stop to the plans of Lilith, the main antagonist of the fourth game, we have to release her father Mephisto, the Lord of Hatred, who, like Diablo, is an immortal demon from the dawn of time, who we fail to contain within the Vessel of Hatred expansion. And we get to see how his mere presence within that world begins to twist and pervert the very fabric of reality. In Vessel of Hatred, just him being contained within a prison called the Soul Stone, just it being in an area with any life, he starts to twist it. Creatures start to mutate and become ravenous, hateful, hollow versions of themselves. Nature begins to blight and rot all around them as hell's essence begins to seep in the world. And he isn't even out of his prison yet. He's contained. And all of these events culminate in the most recent expansion, wherein he corrupts something called the Pools of Creation, which for all intents and purposes is where all humans originate from, and it basically ties them to this world. And when it's tampered with, all living beings, mainly humans, feel the effects. And in the game, this is set up as something like, oh, this can't happen or else we lose immediately. But we do lose. He does corrupt these pools. And when it occurs, we see humans nowhere near his actions begin to twist, their minds shattering right in front of our eyes, bodies mutating en masse as they begin to slaughter one another in a tidal wave of pure hatred. And despite our banishment of him, which is actually one of the most colossal victories we've had, banishing a prime evil for a extended period of time, we still lose. And he tells us as much while we're fighting him. He still corrupted humanity and the foundations of this world. Despite us banishing him outside of reality, he will still return to torment humanity time and again. In the world of Diablo, every victory is hollow, and humans are doomed to fail in this world. And the cosmology reflects that, as humans are trapped in a literal eternal war between the high heavens, a cold and callous faction that is dedicated to the concepts of order, to the point where they actually considered annihilating humanity, as they are partially born of demon kind. And then there's the other side, the burning hells, which host legions of demons that are immortal, as whenever they're slain, their essence always returns to hell to reform, so that they may fight again. And this realm is ruled over by 7 equally immortal and vile gods of hell, for lack of better terms. They're called the Great Evils. And these factions, they see humanity as nothing but pawns on a chessboard. Mephisto in the Lord of Hatred really doesn't care about humanity or corrupting Sanctuary. He's only doing this to spite his daughter Lilith and to show her that her actions were pointless. So when you look at it from this perspective, Diablo is a desperate and terrifying universe. And it's reflected not only in the writing, but to the art direction of this series, where yes, it's kind of got that twinge of cool heavy metal broodiness, depending on what class you're looking at, but across the board, this is the art of horror. This is not the art of high fantasy power. And it also extends to the music that is moody, brooding, and foreboding, atmospheric. And it makes it so when you're playing this game, yes, you're doing crazy cool things where you're blowing up entire screens of demons, but the environments and the writing really reflect just how pointless your hero's efforts are. And all of this is enhanced by the side quest, which shows us just how dire and sad this world is. Towns are left in ruins, with journals left behind documenting how one peaceful northern castle descended rapidly into feeding grounds for vampires and cults to hellish monsters. And to the west, there are cannibals that roam the desert countryside, and ancient tombs hold hordes of undead that are just waiting to wake up, and then races of goatmen that are hell-bent on ascending to godhood. The world of Sanctuary is bleak, horrifying, yet it is a living, breathing, colorful fantasy world. It has all those fun high fantasy elements. Super cool magic, super interesting factions, different species, different sorts of big pauldrons and hulking, all the good power fantasy stuff, But it's all painted in this light that is more horror focused, and it actually gives Diablo this very distinctive identity amongst other fantasy universes. I don't think it gets enough praise for that. But what about a game that decides to use its gameplay to undercut traditional fantasy ideas?
Ruin has come to our family.
And now we get to talk about a very popular game and analyze it from the perspective of mainly gameplay. The irreverent and ever ruinous Darkest Dungeon. And full disclaimer, I'm not finished with this game. I'm pushing through this one live on stream with everyone else here on YouTube and Twitch, kind of intermittently, hard to squeeze in time to stream when you're working 2 separate jobs. So I can't fully speak on the story or every boss fight or the intricacies of individual events, but what I can speak on is how goddamn special the gameplay of this game is. Alright, for those of you who don't know, Darkest Dungeon is I don't know whether to call it a roguelike or just a dungeon crawler, but it's kind of got the meta progression of roguelikes, where you traverse the old estate of you and your party's common ancestors to beat back the darkness that he unleashed upon the land. And you go out in general expeditions, you gather your supplies, you do normal hero stuff. But every expedition is not some triumphant battle, but often, even in the most tame of expeditions, a grueling slog through rancid ruins where all who engage with the event are left ragged and shivering, their minds broken, their bodies destroyed. And every event is really Pyrrhic. The game has some legitimately scary events, like actually scared the shit out of me at some points. In the sense of it's like you're playing like a comic book, basically. It's like Mike Magnolia art. Oh! No, he's fucking back and he's right the fucking way! And some enemies are just too brutal to overcome, even with proper strategy. And A simple act of curious exploration can lead to disastrous outcome. Oh. The sacrifice, but what? Holy! And with each expedition into the estate, you uncover just a little bit more about the atrocities your ancestor committed and the darkness that he unleashed. But it is in the stress system of this game, which every character in your party accumulates throughout the expedition, that really turns this game from simple just dungeon crawler into a true horror story. You watch helplessly as your stalwart heroes and dubious allies turn into complete fiends, cowards, maniac villains, or blood-addicted monsters as their sanity slips away from merely just being near this center of darkness, and how fruitless the journey home always feels. Every combat you win is really just another loss, as your heroes are becoming more and more stressed. Their minds are slipping away more and more. They're contracting diseases, breaking bones, and it adds a lot of weight to every single individual action this game has. Even though if you watch the streams, I am definitely a little aloof. And by a little, I mean a lot. And these mechanics, on top of other things like hunger, and the torch system, it makes the dangers of these dungeons and these individual expeditions feel incredibly real, unlike other dungeon crawling endeavors, which may hint at the greater horrors, or at least say that something is supposed to be horrific or put you against some scary monsters, but ultimately these are undercut by the feeling that allows heroes to ascend beyond these horrors and live their days mostly unscathed. They're not really affected by what happens to them. But while in Darkest Dungeon, I watched one of my favorite heroes get chopped in half by a giant pig man with no warning, which was incredibly tragic. Rest in peace, Doku. And these gameplay elements also add some fun strategy, because I've always been weighing out the possibility of wandering through the halls with just like no torch, just for the extra ambush benefits. And the game rewards this level of madness, and it makes it feel less like a game sometimes and more like a masochism simulator. Speaking of madness, we're not even talking about the fact that when your heroes become too stressed, they develop nearly permanent debuffs that affect how they operate in the game world. It's not just like a little stat change, their personality changes. They will attack allies at random, they'll refuse healings, refuse to perform certain actions, or just attack who they want to, which can cause a whole host of issues. And that even affects them in the overworld, because then they will say things that will stress out your other heroes. They'll antagonize them, or they'll refuse certain treatments when you get them back to town. And if they become too stressed, it culminates in a heart attack, which just kills them outright. And this on top of the fact that enemies are lurking around every corner, and combat in this game is fucking brutal. And these enemies can inflict all sorts of status effects. They can increase your stress. They can basically one-shot you at times. It makes combat feel very, very weighted. Not realistic, just weighted. Weighted in a way that other fantasy games don't allow it to feel. For an example, again, I'm going to bring up like Skyrim, because that's just kind of one of the easiest ones to bring up. When you go into a dungeon and you get injured, you can just walk away and cast some healing spells on yourself. You can drink a health potion usually, or you have an ally that can heal you back to full health. In Darkest Dungeon, you can't do that. The most you can do is like eat some of your food to regain some health, or apply some like very basic medical supplies, but that's slowly draining your resources that you will need at other points in the game. So combat and how to recover from injuries isn't simply just like, oh, we're taking care of our heroes. It's also like carefully measuring what resources you're willing to spend, because you're painting yourself into a very, very desperate corner. And I have done that, where I've pushed my heroes a little too far, and then there's just death and sadness everywhere. Big cherry on top is how putrid the enemies are. Embodies what I love about the fantasy horror aspect. These are fantasy enemies, skeletons, beastmen, vampires, cultists, but with a twist. None of these things look cool. I audibly screamed at some of them. These aren't typical monsters. Those skeletons are real bastards that remember how to fight, and they are decaying corpses. Those vampires aren't your traditional kindred. They aren't suave debonaires in the night. These are monstrous mosquito hybrids that have mutated vile appendages and rancid orifices that wear the regalia of the nobles that they once wore while they continue to try and maul you. And those beastmen, these aren't goat men with cool armor. These are slobbering pig-human hybrids that are just covered in gore. And it gives the game a very unique edge that I have rarely ever seen in another game. It makes Darkest Dungeon feel like more than just a typical fantasy experience. And it makes the gameplay loop of Darkest Dungeon an honest-to-God scary experience. Not even mentioning the ambient music. Oh my god, the Warrens, if you let your torch go to 0, you know what? I'll just let you listen to it. Now, I want to talk about a game that is, let's be real, very well known on this channel. It's Fear and Hunger, and do I even need to really elaborate on this? No, I do not, but you bet your sweet bippy I will. Fear and Hunger, just the game that you are. No matter how many times I go back to you, I am always enthralled by everything you do. It is perhaps one of the best versions of a horror fantasy game I've ever played, and I think what makes it so horrifying is how unassuming it is. It looks and plays like a normal JRPG, even if it's a bit spooky and edgy. The story is textbook, and not too subversive to the traditional dark fantasy archetypes, but this game manages to fly off the rails in such an incredible fashion, combining not only interesting gameplay mechanics and overworld navigation with a very interesting story that poses a lot of new ideas and wears sort of this occultic cloak all over itself that makes it just intoxicating to look at. And for those who don't know, Fear and Hunger is an indie JRPG and survival horror game that is renowned for its dark fantasy elements and how it prioritizes sanity and hunger as major gameplay elements that you must manage while delving into a dungeon of rancid nightmares. You must also unravel the esoteric mystery of the enigmatic 𝒞𝒽𝓁, who is the reason your character goes into the dungeon in the first place, along with unveiling the secrets of the dungeon and realizing that you are in way in over your head. And what makes this game such a perfect horror fantasy experience for me is how you have to manage your life with such careful precision. Every action, even if you plan it out, is something that you have to take measurements for. You have to be very careful and plan out your next move. And if you're running through the dungeon blindly, you're going to exhaust yourself and get killed. And this manifests in a few ways. For one, combat. Combat absolutely prioritizes knowing your enemy and being prepared. Every enemy has attacks and special abilities that are assigned to different limbs, and you, as the player, have to attack those limbs first. For a simple one is the guard. The guard has a cleaver in his right hand, and his left hand has a one-shot attack. And if you cut off his right hand with the cleaver, he can no longer hit you with the attack that will chop off your limbs, crippling your character for the rest of the game. And if you cut off his left hand, which allows him to do a special attack, it's no longer available to him, and all he can really do is tackle you. You can also hack your enemies' legs off so that they'll lose their balance and make them one-shottable to headshots.
And this really emphasizes that it's very smart to understand your opponents. You got to understand the monsters that you're going to be fighting before you get into the fight with them. If you're ill-prepared, it'll bite you in the butt because of the fact that your enemies will have attacks that you won't know how to manage or dodge yet. And even in combat where you're prepared and you understand how to fight your enemies, there's still all sorts of random things that can happen. Attacks can miss, critical strikes, and if you think that magic would probably allow you to have an edge, it does, but even magic has a devastating cost. It saps your mind every time you use it, and some of your spells can just straight up backfire and do outstandingly terrible things to you and your party. In Fear and Hunger 2, if you use the Scorched Earth spell, it makes it so all fire damage is increased by all sources. So if an enemy also decides to use any sort of fire-based attack, it will basically one-shot your party. And in Fear and Hunger 1, if you go to use spells like Necromancy, Necromancy can backfire and raise a hostile skeleton that you then have to fight and spend extra resources trying to resurrect again. And combat isn't the only place where this careful management of resources and elements occurs. You also have to manage your resources in the overworld. You have to make sure that your route is planned so tight-knit whenever you are running through the dungeon. You have to know that you are going to be going from point A to point B to point Z in a pretty timely fashion, because if you're playing on any of the harder difficulties, if you run out of something like torches, you're just going to be left stranded in the dark for the rest of the game. Or you will start running out of food that your party desperately needs, or else they'll become very weak, or they will run out of sanity and they'll either leave your party entirely or they'll just be crippled for the rest of the game. And this isn't even getting into the fact that there are lots of enemies that can attack you in the overworld, and there are enemies that will only appear under certain circumstances, such as the Crow Mauler or the Death Masks in Fear and Hunger 2. You have to constantly be managing where you are in the game and how many resources you are willing to expend and manage. These elements make it so the game feels like it has weight. Like, yes, you're doing fantasy stuff, you are fantasy characters, but you do not have the benefits of traditional high fantasy settings. Every action has a consequence, and it makes the game so scary without trying to be really scary. And moving on to those scary elements, this is a high fantasy world with high fantasy monsters and settings, and it's all wrapped in this guise of like Lovecraftian and bleak dark fantasy. And it makes the world feel very unique, and it makes it stand out amongst other settings. Like, yeah, you're fighting wizards, you're fighting mutated monsters, but you're also fighting the vestiges of dead gods, and you're fighting the maddened humans who have tried to ascend to godhood, and you get to see just how monstrous and how depraved this world really is. You get to see some pretty disturbing crimes, all in all, in this game. Not that I think that is, you know, something that needs to be carried on in all elements of the series. Certainly Fear and Hunger 2 tones it down a bit, but it does make the setting feel grittier and a little bit more real in a way that you just usually wouldn't get to see. And it feels less grotesque and more just like kind of a natural part of the world. Save a few things, like the night lurches. Those things suck, and I think what they do is pretty gross, and it feels more silly. And moving on to more of this high fantasy world, the cosmology of Fear and Hunger, that I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, is one that is incredibly deep and has really unsettling themes while not being just morbid for the sake of morbid. You have entities like 𝒞𝒽𝒻, who usually in any other fantasy world would be seen as like the quintessential cosmic energy, like, oh, it's the god of destruction, that he's some sort of mistake or glitch in creation. But 𝒞𝒽𝒻 is one of the primal forces of creation that is neither good nor bad. Yes, he is the progenitor of blood magic and human sacrifice, but also he is one of the people that helped to create mankind and has a very intimate knowledge of mankind and has been a deity that has interacted with mankind the most. So this makes this world feel incredibly grim and sad in the same way that Diablo does, but it feels neutral at the same time. And the horror comes from the fact that this is just the way the world is. And this isn't even talking about entities such as logic or sulfur, or the death of the god of the depths, or how the one true good god of humanity is the god of fear and hunger. So it ends up making Fear and Hunger feel just like a completely unique world in this realm of fantasy. And circling back to the gameplay elements, the dungeon itself is this place of pure dread. There's no music really, and all you can hear is the wandering of other enemies and kind of like little droning sounds on occasion. And it makes it so navigating the dungeon just feels that much more dangerous, that much more serious. Nothing is promised to you. There is no cool piece of loot. Everything is based on luck. And it makes it so friends are super, super meaningful when you find them out in the dungeon. But the worst part is that you realize these people are just as twisted, if not more so, than the creatures that are crawling in the depths of the dungeon. You have characters like Enki, who's supposed to be one of the protagonists, but he's one of the most evil dudes in the series, and he's one of the only people who gets what he wants. And then you have characters like Darce, the noble and loyal knight, but she is noble and loyal to a genocidal maniac who does not care about her or anybody else. And so you take these staples of the fantasy genre, you take these staples of JRPG gameplay, and you just flip that all on its head. And I think that's what helps to make Fear and Hunger just so unique in the world of not only horror games, but more specifically in fantasy games. And I'm mainly talking about Fear and Hunger 1. Fear and Hunger 2 is its own special cake, but that's a conversation for a different day.
And that's the video. So, in conclusion, fantasy horror can kind of manifest in a lot of different ways, but it emphasizes these themes of terror and hopelessness and being out of power when fantasy would usually put you in power in these situations. And how these sort of moments and these themes can actually create for completely novel stories and very interesting experiences. When the player or the reader or the audience is not in control of the situation and they are at the whims of supernatural creatures, there's a lot of fun storytelling opportunities there. And you can see it in Diablo, where I think it has helped make that series iconic outside of just its ARPG gameplay. You can see it in Darkest Dungeon, which really thrusts you into the position of being a powerless adventurer fighting cosmic horrors. And likewise, you can also see this in Fear and Hunger, where you can see a traditional like JRPG style game turned on its head and turned into one of the most gruesome, brutal experiences that is known in modern gaming, at least in my humble opinion. But if you guys enjoyed, please stick around, subscribe, drop a like, leave a comment, or the inverse of the two, however you feel like it. And if you feel so inclined, come join the Discord and come catch me on my streams on Twitch and here. I also have a second channel up where I post a lot of shorts and rants and rambles. It's kind of just more of a secondary outlet for the channel in general. Or you can follow me on TikTok. Please follow me on TikTok, where I'm doing similar activities. But with all that out of the way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are at in the world, and thanks for stopping by the Stygian Study. Doodles!